great to have had. It's great to have had, a number of people, about 10 or so, register, which is really great because we know that everyone's got a lot on their plate, and to be able to find the time to come and hear some discussion, to hear the presentation and to have some discussion on this very important topic. I've been involved at sea now for just under a year. I came on board just before Christmas last year, and sort of really fully hit the ground in about early February in the role. And the reason I'm here, I've had a long history of working in the corporate sustainability space and done a few other different sort of roles, but it's been a pretty consistent theme through my work for about the last 25 years. And having been involved with sport in other areas, it was a really wonderful opportunity to come on board and bring the two together. I think, as we're going to hear from Terry and also the presentation from David, there's certainly a lot happening out there in our climate and our world, and sport is on the front line of both the impacts, but also going to have some of the results that are going to happen as a result of that. So I think it's really really important that we do start to think about what we can do and think about what we can share and collaborate on, and also engage our own communities on in regards to this really important topic. So without going on any further, I'll introduce Terry. So Terry is one of the founders of or the founder of epar, which is an organisation that is a great partner of sea. So we're really delighted that epar work with us. I've been on to sort of, if I go into Terry's website or the epar website and have a look at what they do, I love the language that they have on there, and that's about that they. epar is about protecting people, communities, and ecosystems. And they have a little phrase that I saw on their website that says, enabling impact that matters. And I think that's really powerful. And I think it's really great that we've got someone like Terry who is just so passionate about working with sporting organisations in across a lot of different spheres, and working on how to help those organisations understand what's happening with regards to environment and climate, but also then what you can do about it. So Terry, I'm going to hand over to you, and really just delighted to have you on board today. And I know we're all going to learn heaps and have some great discussions. So thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you, Jan. Thank you to C for organising this, and in particular you, Rebecca, for making this all happen. And thank you to everybody for your attendance. We've got about an hour, I think, or obviously a little bit less now, to run you through a little bit of a climate journey. And we thought it would be best to start with Professor David Karoly's presentation that he gave at the C conference. He's going to talk to the science, and then I'm going to speak to the impacts. And at the end of all of that, we're going to invite a lot of questions. Hopefully you've got a lot of questions, and my job here is to make sure we can answer those questions the best we can. But my background basically is I came from the EPA as an environmental regulator, and I was prosecuting a number of sporting organisations when I was on the dark side, as they say. And I then went off and did a master's, and I've been involved in sport and sustainability and compliance since 2002. And that was when I did my master's in environmental science. And I can remember back then we were asked to write papers on what countries will benefit. I can remember the word, what country will benefit from climate change? And we actually had answers back then, and we were absolutely wrong. And it's quite amazing how times are changing and the science is evolving, and sport, who people say is the victim and the villain. And we're going to unpack that as we go. And it's going to be, hopefully a really enjoyable next 40 minutes. And I'd like to hand over to Rebecca to play David's video. And then once that's complete, I'll then jump on. I'll share my screen with my PowerPoint, and we'll unpack what that actually means, and we'll focus on how climate change is not bypassing sport. Thanks, Rebecca.
No problem. Thanks, Terry. Can everybody see that?
Thanks a lot, Jan. And I've come dressed for this presentation as is entirely appropriate, and I'm going to give a very brief introduction to myself before I get into the sort of nerdy part of the science of climate change. I got into climate change and climate variability science because I was always interested in outdoor activities and playing sport. My first team sport was in the under-12s Warrawee Football Club, which is in fact a soccer club, when I was 8 years old. Competitive, because there wasn't younger kids team than the under-12s in Sydney in Warrawee. Anyhow, actually maybe it was the Wahroonga under-12s, but look, don't worry about that. I have played competitively a lot of sports. I will be going skiing next week at Mount Buller while there is still some snow cover, because the Winter Olympics are in deep doo-doo because the snow cover is dropping and it's too hot. I've played sports in the United States, the United Kingdom, and in Australia, and you name it, I've probably tried it. Not very well, and I'm more an active participant than almost anything else, and certainly an active spectator. But I got interested in climate change because I actually have a maths and physics background, because they're easy subjects. I'm a classic nerd, and the only way that I could work out how to communicate physics and maths to my mother, who was at the time the most important person in my life, was to do something that was involving the environment in physics and maths, and that was weather and climate. And I got involved and have been involved since then in using maths and physics and the environment, because the environment is core to my values. So I'm going to talk, I've now got 12 minutes to talk about the 6,000 pages of the latest IPCC science assessment. Fortunately, there is a 16-page version of it, because the IPCC now realises that 6,000 pages is too much, particularly when it's only 10-point font. I'm going to start with shifting to a cursor that isn't a pointer, but is a laser pointer. And now I can use this and not actually have to bend my arm backwards to point to the screen. When I look at this first graphic, it's the global average temperatures. Countries around the world, all of them that are involved in the UN Framework Convention, are seeking to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees of warming, and to seek to limit it to 1.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century. We're already at 1.2 degrees of warming, and if you look at the extreme heat waves that are and bushfires that are affecting Europe, China, North America at present, it's an example that I will talk about. If we look at this graphic, we see that there's actually been essentially no warming, or very little warming, but a lot of year-to-year variability, and that year-to-year variability is important to recognise as part of natural climate variability, and it's the long-term trend that is essentially the thing that we're really trying to, first of all, be aware of, and then to address. So what I'm going to do, and I think I need to use the clicker to make this work, is to look at the essentially projections into the future and what we've seen already, and I will focus on some key conclusions from these IPCC assessment reports. If we want to look at what's happened, actually I think I can go backwards. I said that we've had 1.2 degrees of warming already. Let's look at the warming level that we've seen across Australia. That's the jagged line in here, larger year-to-year variations, and the 20-year running average in here shows clearly warming of about, notice the 0 is relative to pre-industrial, we've actually got up to more than 1.5 degrees of warming. And the last 10-year average across Australia is 1.4 or 1.5 degrees relative to the pre-industrial. So the first question, and I've given this talk, how many people here were at the Richmond Football Club environment? Jan was, so she's heard most of this before. No one else has, so I can use some of the same jokes. Most sport on land is played by humans, occasional horses as well, but I usually say most people aren't fish. Now, swimming and sailing is critically important in the oceans, but most land-based sports should be aware that the land average temperature is about 50% higher than the global average. So when we talk about 2 degrees of warming, which is up here, sorry, this is 1.5 degrees. 2 degrees is here, the Australian warming is going to be close to 2.9 degrees. Why do we not talk about the land average warming? Because most people live on land or on islands. Politicians don't talk about land average warming because it's a lot bigger. Below the observed temperatures is climate model simulations from multiple global climate models of the Australian average temperatures and how they vary in the climate models for simulations that started in 1850. Yes, they show the year-to-year variability, and they show this pronounced warming. And these models include the increases in greenhouse gases due to human activity and also projections into the future. Now, it's really interesting. Was the record hottest year in Australia and contributed to those record high temperatures to the black summer bushfires and heat waves that we had in that summer. The only problem is 2019 here, then we had a La Nina event. Australian average temperatures and global average temperatures cool during La Nina events, but we're heading towards an El Nino event. 2019 was a weak El Nino event. If we have a strong El Nino event, we will set new record Australian average temperatures and new global average record temperatures in 2024. 2023 will be terrible in Australia if we have an El Nino event, because it will lead to dry conditions in the spring and in the summer. What are we about if we look at 2040? This is where we're going in 2040. These are the range of temperatures across Australia year to year and the spread. Every dry year will have new record high temperatures, and unfortunately the 2019 temperatures will actually be below average in the 2040s. We can't do anything about that. Those warming is locked in by past human activity and its emissions. But we need to act yesterday or a decade ago to reduce emissions fast enough so that we don't exceed 1.5 degrees. So let's move on. Well, we know, I've talked about temperature extremes. What about rainfall extremes? Well, rainfall is really important for people, for water resources, for agriculture, for native ecosystems. We're seeing across much of southern parts of Australia declines in rainfall in the cool season, which makes it extremely difficult to grow grass, for football of whatever code, and to have turf wickets anywhere, and particularly in inland areas. The increases in temperature and the reductions in rainfall are critically important. Well, what about the future? Well, I've talked about 1.5 degrees. These are the temperature projections for a range of future emission scenarios. The worst case, if you like, was something called business as usual, which is no longer business as usual, and that led to 5 degrees of global average temperatures. But remember, 50% higher is 7.5, 8 degrees of land average warming. We're beyond that now. We're much more likely to be following this emission scenario, which gets us to 2.8 degrees because of government action already. What we also need to recognise is that that warming is still going up in 2100. The only two that don't have increases in temperatures in 2100 are these two very low emissions, and they actually, the only one that is particularly low and achieves a 1.5 degrees warming at the end of the century is this one here. That required emissions reductions starting in the past. But we can do it. We just have to make sure that we act in terms of emission reductions. So these are the emission scenarios that I was talking about. This one here is the very low emissions. It gets down to 1.5 degrees of global warming in 2100. Fortunately, I can go back. Notice that the peak in temperatures was actually around 2040 or 2050. That's because after that we achieved, in at least this scenario, net zero global emissions. Part of the UN Framework Convention says that developed countries need to take the lead in combating emissions, which means that us developed countries need to have zero emissions well before 2050, preferably by 2030 or earlier. That's a tough ask. Don't plan for in sports that will achieve net zero in 2050 in Australia, because it needs to be earlier than that. You need to plan for a more aggressive strategy. And why do we get zero? Well, sorry, why do we need reduced emissions? Because we only essentially get to a peak in global temperatures when carbon dioxide emissions get to zero. Temperatures will continue to warm a little bit after that, but the only time we can reduce temperatures is getting to below zero emissions. Now, there is no vacuum cleaner apart from trees and vegetation that sucks carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere effectively and efficiently. Dyson doesn't have a vacuum cleaner yet in Australia that sucks carbon dioxide out yet. If you invent one, you'll make a lot of money. So we need 10 billion tonnes sucked out of the atmosphere every year to achieve 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. And all of these other ones, which have still have positive emissions, make things worse. I've got to speed up. There are lots of impacts. You're aware of them. We've seen them in the last decade in Australia. Increases in temperature extremes, increases in bushfires, increases in sea level. These slides will be made available publicly to all the participants across the whole of the 2 conferences. So you can take pictures. I'm dressed up for pictures, but you don't have to take pictures of me or pictures of the slides. And I'm modest too. Okay, what do we need to worry about? I've talked about a whole bunch of the things. Marine heat waves are critically important as well. They're killing coral ecosystems in the Great Barrier Reef. Land ecosystems have major impacts on native species and vegetation. We need to be concerned about them. Whoops. Let me come back to here. So, what can sport do? Well, you're going to hear a lot more about what sport is doing and can do from both Claire and Terry in later sports, but I'm going to quickly summarise a few things. We know that summertime heat extremes are the dominant adverse factor. We are already experiencing, not only in Europe, but also in Australia, 50 degrees Celsius days. The other thing you need to bear in mind is the temperatures that are being talked about by me and many climate scientists are temperatures in the shade, in a well-ventilated environment. And you don't play most sports in the shade in a well-ventilated environment. There's standard WMO temperature observations. That's what's required. That means that the changes can be much larger. And in a cricket field or in the Melbourne Open tennis, on a sunny day, the temperatures will often be 70 degrees Celsius, and if you exercise in those temperatures, you will die or collapse before you die. It is not a good idea. There are many sorts of impacts, particularly inland. We also need to make sure that sports can contribute to the solutions, partly through advocacy, partly through action to reduce. And it's particularly travel for the players, for the audience, for the spectators. We know how to fix it. We've known how to fix the solutions for a long time. More efficient use of energy, using zero carbon energy sources, I should point out that this summary comes from the previous IPCC report, and if you look at the small font, you'll see this came out in 2013. It's not the current summary, this is old summary. We need to have carbon sinks, like deforestation, like forest management. We can't keep cutting down trees unless we do it properly, and many of the biggest changes will be in lifestyle and behavioural changes. Summary slide. The human influence on the climate system is clear. But every time we emit more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, particularly if it involves burning fossil fuels, the lifetime for those fossil fuels in the atmosphere is about 1,000 to 10,000 years. Those extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere cycles between the atmosphere, the upper layers of the ocean, and vegetation on the land surface. And then it goes back into the atmosphere and gets cycled around. To remove it long term, you need ocean sediments, or you need to get it stored into rocks. That takes a bloody long time. Every time we emit more carbon dioxide, it adds to global warming. Every time we don't emit it, it reduces the potential future warming that would have happened if those emissions went ahead. Yes, we can suck carbon dioxide out, but if those trees die because of bushfires, it makes things worse. We know that a sustainable response to climate change leads to a more prosperous economy and a sustainable future. The only problem for Australia is it has the highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions of any developed country in the world. We are more responsible per person for climate change than any other developed country in the world. We have bigger emissions per person than the United States or the United Kingdom or any other developed country, and we are effectively per capita only worse off than Saudi Arabia and some of the other Arab countries. But that doesn't count Australia's exports of coal and fossil gas, which treble Australia's domestic emissions. We need to not only stop our domestic emissions, we need to keep the coal and fossil gas underground. Most people in sport are not aware that export of coal and fossil gas trebles Australia's contribution to making global warming worse. We can fix it. We don't need to do it. We have enough sunlight and wind in Australia to provide all the energy we need, and we can export that energy sustainably. Overseas, we don't need to export coal and oil. We've got plenty of sunshine, we enjoy it, we get sunburnt by it sometimes, unless you're good people. I'm going to finish up here. If you want all the references, you can get them, but don't take the slides because they're going to be shared to everyone. Thank you very much. I will be around today.
Okay. Back over to you, Terry.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Did you see that okay?
Yep.
That all good? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I've got about 15 to 20 minutes, and I'm going to unpack, excuse me, a lot of the information that David just shared with us. And I need to say every time I hear that, he's such a powerful speaker, and the information that he says really resonates with me. Part of my job is to try and make that resonate with people that we work with in the sporting world. So for the next 15 to 18 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about the changing climate and its impact on sport. And I'd like to start with this shot. For those of you that aren't familiar with the eastern suburbs of Sydney, that's Bondi Beach down to the south and Sydney Harbour to the north. You can see the highly urbanised area, and in the middle of it, if you look close enough, It almost looks like a lung, when in fact it's a golf course. It's some bowling greens, it's some rugby parks, it's some croquet areas, it's some tennis courts, it's gyms and swimming pools. It's an amazing precinct or an amazing sporting facility that does a great job in our community. But when you consider the information that David just shared with us and the things that we're seeing on the ground, it's going to be significantly impacted as we move towards 2050 and increasing emissions. And I'm going to talk to that and the impact that the changing climate's going to have on that little jewel of the Sydney's eastern suburbs, which include, and I'm going to unpack a lot more of it as we go, but it's going to be subject to drought and heat and extreme weather events and rising sea level. Workers are going to be exposed to all of those elements and events too. And there's a lot more, but we'll talk about that as we go. But it's a nice way to segue into this comment from Alan, who I think's got the dream job as the environmental advisor to the New York Yankees. He basically said that every community that hosts a sporting event is going to be affected by the disruptions that are going to be caused as a result of our continuing emissions of CO2. And what that means is, without a doubt, climate change is not bypassing sport. I see it every day. We're working with around 400 facilities here in Australia and around 700 in North America. And there's not one of them that's not impacted by some of the things that we're going to speak about today. And this is my first example for the presentation. And we're going to go from the top right of the screen, and simply because this was just published yesterday after the Formula One GP event in Qatar. And you may have read it or you may have heard about it, but as a result of the event and the heat and the stress that the drivers and the athletes were subjected to, some were fainting, a lot of them were physically ill. You would have heard reports due to the heat and the fatigue. Some of them were vomiting into their helmets as a result of the heat. If we go to the left, I shared this with Rebecca earlier. It's quite amazing. So absolutely, a warming climate is going to influence sport, its athletes, its volunteers, its workers, but it's also likely to influence the record books. And this is a study that was recently released that said it's going to result in an increased number of home runs in baseball games.
Not too bad, thank you. What's been happening?
We've got someone joining us, I think. Okay. So what else could that mean? Well, does that mean a warming climate's going to influence the how quickly someone can kick 1,000 goals in the AFL? Are they going to do it quicker than Buddy Franklin did? Are we going to see little asterisks in the record books to say this happened during the warming years? I'm not sure, but it's happening and it's real. And you'll see bottom right of the screen another study from 2021 that showed that just one of 21 cities would be able to safely host a Winter Games. And that's of the 21 cities that have previously hosted an Olympic Games. But it's not just that sport's got to concern itself with. We use resources, and there's some images on here that I want to share with you. And one on the left was from some organisations that are targeting sport as a resource consumer and a significant impactor on the environment. And they're scraping into some of the turf areas in the sporting arenas that more tigers, more woods. The next shot you'll see, this was from Scandinavia, where they were planting trees in a number of golf course greens as a protest to the amount of water that the golf course was using. You'll see there, the next one across was where they decided to fill the golf holes with cement, again in protest to the amount of water and chemicals being used on the golf course, so they thought they could take the golf course out of play. So whilst the golf and the sports industry is dealing with a changing climate, it's also got to deal with public views and public opinions of that sport. And that leads me to that photo on the far right. That's a golf facility along the Cooks River in Sydney that is doing everything it can to map its environment and sustainability assets and its climate change work, so it can demonstrate that this course is doing its part and playing its role in sports climate change journey. And why are we doing this? Well, absolutely. Sports changing, and that's simply because the climate in which every sporting organisation was born, it no longer exists. You would recall from David's presentation, at one point last year, we warmed to 2 degrees. We're already at 1.2. The temperature on the ground can be as warm as 5 degrees. And the global average expectation of 3 degrees is not that in Australia. Projections are that it could be as high as 8 degrees. Now, when we go around to some of the sporting organisations, when we do some of their climate vulnerability testing or scenario testing, we say, can you remember last year's heat wave? And most of them will say, yeah, 43 degrees. And we say, look, the indications are that that heat wave is going to arrive maybe as many as 4 times a year, and it could be up to 8 times warmer and twice as long. So they were doing scenario testing based on 51, 52 and 53 degree work days. What impact would that have on the quality of the turf? What impact would it have on the workers? What impact would it have on the volunteers? And what impact would it have on the athletes? And what impact would it have on their resource management? And here are some of the things that we know are happening now, with nighttime temperatures rising faster than daytime. From a sports facility management perspective, that has a significantly huge impact on sporting surface quality, because if we have humid conditions, there is absolutely no reason why there won't be an increase in fungicide and turf quality issues, which presents its own range of issues to the athlete. No doubt we're going to get an increased number of lightning strikes and an increased risk. Projections are that for every 1 degree of warming, we're actually going to receive up to 12% increase in lightning strikes. And when you look at the numbers in the blue box, that's going to be significant. So when you think about it, let's say we get a 30% increase in lightning strikes. What is that going to do to athlete safety? But what is it also going to do to broadcast availability and quality? Are the athletes going to have to leave the arena earlier? And we see it every year in cricket in particular. The storm's approaching. The athletes, the umpires go one way, and then the workers go the other way, straight into the storm. I think there's going to be some significant push to increase the time difference between when they go off, and that's going to impact broadcasting. This is one of my favourite slides when we talk about this sort of thing, and it's to do with increased rain events and these microbursts or these rain bombs that we're experiencing and will continue to experience, and the impact that's going to have on sport. And you'll be interested to know that, you know, the world's largest rivers are actually not land-based, they're atmospheric-based. And there's around 12 up to 15 of them sort of floating around in the atmosphere, because every 1 degree of warming that we do adds between 5 and 7% of water vapour. And so that means these atmospheric rivers can be 2,000 kilometres long, like this one approaching Hawaii. They can be 500 kilometres wide and 5 kilometres thick. And if you might recall that big event we had in Sydney back in 2021, nearly 9.6 Sydney harbours of water went over the city in just the one day. And we can only imagine the impact that this would have on a sporting facility, which is illustrated in this slide. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen is an agricultural pursuit. On the left-hand side is a horse facility, a dressage and a polo centre that was subject to a storm event. And this is what happened. So these microbursts are going to become more common, and they're going to become more intensive, and they're going to cause more impact. But we're also going to have to experience this, and we're going to have to come up with management strategies to help us deal with this. And it simply means that the indications are we're going to get a threefold increase in pollen and allergy management by 2040, which is only 15 to 17 years away. So sporting organisations are going to have to put in place strategies to deal with that. And of course, as the tropics move further south, the vectors will accompany them. And we're seeing some of these diseases in Australia that we just have not seen for a long time. And so we're going to have to work out strategies on how do we deal with protecting our athletes, our workers, our volunteers, when they're exposed to these types of things in their general daily engagement with sport. Now, I don't think we can talk about sport without talking about food, because hospitality is a significant factor in sporting organisations. Now, again, with 1 degree of warming, the indications are we're going to get those declines in our food staples. The question is, what does that do to food quality, food availability, and food pricing that we're going to have to really seriously consider? And then, of course, I know this is one of Jan's favourites, to try and make this more relevant to people who like to go to a sporting event for some coffee or chocolate. We're going to be in some strife. If the projections continue and our emission rates continue, coffee already is significantly exposed to what they're calling this leaf rust, and it's absolutely ruining coffee plantations. The ideal altitude is around 1,200, but it looks as though the altitude for growing coffee is going to have to go to 1,600 metres. The land availability is just not there, and it's going to be reduced by at least 50%. Indications are that there's only a 10% chance that after 2050 we'll be able to enjoy an Arabica coffee. And then when we talk about 2050 in relation to chocolate, it's no different to coffee. It grows in a certain region, and now that region looks as though it's going to be 450 to 500 metres higher above sea levels, and we can't do it. And of 294 locations that have been tested, the suitability shows only about 10% of them will be able to produce the cacao needed for chocolate in a warming climate. So all of these things are going to impact on the consumers at sporting events. And sporting events, because of the changing climate, they need to now start engaging with what I think is going to be a fantastic opportunity for sport, is the climatarians. And these are just food consumers, and they've just got an interest in the origin of their food. And you can see on the right-hand screen, there are lots of examples of where this is absolutely working, and low carbon menus are being examined by a lot of organisations. And I'm sorry to put this one up there for you people in Melbourne, but if you get a chance, just jump onto the Climate Central website. It's a really scientifically based platform where you can test some scenarios in relation to sea level rise. So I thought for today I would just throw in, well, what happens at 3 degrees to the Melbourne Tennis Centre? And I looked at it very quickly, and I quickly got off it, because at our current rate, based on the science, this is where we are headed. And we all know what impacts that's going to have on sport. But there's no doubt that the science that David just introduced you to, and some of the things that we're seeing out there in the workplace, is going to be an accelerant for change. As I said, the sporting organisations are starting to move, but I don't think they're moving quick enough. And on the screen you'll see in front of you, these are the areas that we identify in any of our climate risk assessments or our vulnerability scenarios, is the increased heat waves, most likely fourfold. The changing weather patterns, you'll see sea level rises is going to cause all sorts of impact to community sport, particularly so when a lot of community sports have been built in floodplains. Water scarcity is going to be an issue. I was at one facility yesterday that's got 40 meg of water to get it through from now until the end of summer. It's not going to make it. Organisations need to start thinking about emergency drought plans. We've already know bushfires are arriving early this year. We already know that's going to cause significant air pollution for everybody involved in sport. Air pollution already kills about 9 million people a year around the globe. Those projections are obviously going to increase. The sports infrastructure is going to be vulnerable to damage from storm events, from rising sea level. Most sporting organisations are obviously going to be impacted from disruption. And you might remember the marathon event from last year, that an hour into the event, they just called it and said, it's too hot, we can't do that. I've already spoken to the vectors and the disease management protocols that we're going to have in place. Sporting organisations need to get ready for rising insurance costs based mostly on weather events and risk to people and their athletes. There's some papers out there too about the psychological impact this is having on athletes because of the uncertainty of their event schedules and their preparations for events. And then I keep talking about health and safety, and a lot of organisations are building their climate plans, and it's fantastic. But I'm also really supportive of, let's get some low-hanging fruit and let's really start getting some information out there that resonates with a lot of people, and that is health, safety and welfare of the athlete. The 3 million volunteers that we've got across the country that work for free, and we're going to ask them to do stuff for sport in heat and in weather events. We've got to manage our spectators. And what about the workers? We're going to send somebody out in a 42, 45 degree day to irrigate turf, to keep that turf alive. Will the WorkSafe regulations allow us to do that? So most sporting organisations are already doing really well in this space, but I think there's a lot that can do a lot more. And of course, with the heat and the changing weather conditions, athlete training regimes, availability of training facilities and venues is absolutely going to be impacted. And that's what a lot of organisations are doing. They've already started their climate plans. They're working on enhancing the climate literacy of their workers, of their volunteers, and even their athletes. And Water Polo Australia is a great example of that. A lot of organisations are putting together their climate change position statements and working through their simple plans of targeting their emissions and their scope 3, which is mostly their biggest emission factor. But not enough are telling their story. And not enough of them are doing these sorts of things like these emergency drought plans. At what stage can I no longer support maintaining this turf? And you could actually mathematically formulate your own strategy. And this is a strategy we worked out with a golf facility not too long ago, where they knew when they were which is quite interesting, their tipping point. Most sporting organisations are now starting to move towards the SDGs. And as you see, number 3 is low-hanging fruit. But I also believe that 9 out of 10 sporting organisations can align with at least 8 to 9 of these really quickly. And because most of them are already doing some really great things. But what they're not doing, they're not telling the story. And the low-hanging fruit is to do what we're doing right here today, is just talking about it and trying to enhance the literacy, the understanding and the awareness of climate change and its influences. Every session I go to, we get a range of people in the room who understand it, people who are thinking about it, and we also get the skeptics, and that's fine. But we've got to start talking more about it and enhancing their understanding of it, because under the SDGs, particularly number 13.3, that influences up to 54 SDG targets, which is an amazing result. And again, something that all sports facilities can do to help them minimise it and set goals. Like we're trying to organise and arrange for 2030 champions to be in sport. And as I'm just winding down my presentation, David's talked about it. The science is unequivocal. The impacts, I'm seeing them every day. As we move towards 2050, the impacts on sport and its athletes and its participants and its supporters are just going to continue to increase. Sport has to take action. But I'd like to finish with this slide. I saw this at a seminar that I was at one day, and it resonated with me because what if we do create a better world? We know it's not a hoax, but we've got to convince more people that it's not a hoax so they can take action and we get buy-in from everybody else. And all we want to do is what you can see on the right-hand side of the screen is if we can continue to have these climate conversations, just like this one, it'll play a significant part in hopefully everybody's journey. And I hope it's played some role in your climate journey, helping you better understand the science and help maybe provide more information to you in relation to the significant impacts that sport is and will continue to be exposed to. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And I think I'm going back to Rebecca for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. If you're just able to, whether you want to leave your slide up, has anybody got any questions that they'd like to share? There's nothing in the chat at the moment, but perhaps if people just want to unmute themselves and ask some questions. I think both Terry and David have presented a lot of really insightful and if not quite scary information, so you're probably just all absorbing it because there is a lot there to take in and it can be quite overwhelming, but we're all in it together. We all understand that's why we're all here today, and as Terry said, the idea is that we need to spread this information further afield and get other people on board. So if there's anybody got ideas about how they might be doing that in their organisation, or that they can share what they're doing within their organisation, or if you've got any questions for Terry about the science and some of the stuff that he's presented, we'd love to hear from you. If anybody's a bit shy to do that now, then feel free to send those emails to myself or to Terry, and we can follow those up for you. But yeah, I'll give you guys a minute maybe just to think if there's something that you would like to ask.
Look, I didn't have a question specifically, but just wanted to say thank you. And as I said, I'm from the City of Melbourne, so our focus is more on community sport. We have some elite sporting organisations in our municipality, but yeah, our focus is on community sport. So it's really interesting to hear things like you're talking about pitch curation and staff risks about what conditions we're sending our staff out into and what that's going to look like in the future. So yeah, I think there's two things for us. It's about how our sporting clubs are affected and then how our sort of staff in areas like parks and city greening, which is who look after our sports facilities and how it impacts them. So yeah, really interesting things to think about and worry about.
Do you mind if I ask you a question, Hannah? Is it something that you've started to look at, or is it something that's even the sport, or the community sporting organisations themselves have come back to you or you've heard them talking about? Is it something that is starting to get a bit of traction?
It's interesting. So I'm from the Recreation and Waterways branch. So we are, I guess, the users, and we look after our sporting clubs who use our facilities. We also have a different branch, Parks and City Greening, who actually are responsible for the upkeep of our facilities and sporting grounds. So I can't speak for them and what they're doing in terms of sustainability practices for particularly things like turf curation. But I know that, sometimes we hear from our sports clubs, what are we doing? From City of Melbourne's point of view, we have a really good overall council climate position and sustainability policy, but I don't think it's trickling down quite into our specific policies or practices around sports fields and facility management. So, as I said, we've got a really good broad council position, but yeah, I don't know how much specifically. We think about it in things like design of rec centres and going all electric and having no gas facilities, but yeah, I'm not sure if it's getting down to the community sport level just yet.
Terry, I'd be interested just to follow that line of thinking, because I do think it is a really important one, because it really starts to play out with, we're all here because we understand the impact of the changing climate, probably on sport. But I think we're now starting to think about that more governance and risk and that side of thing. And I think, Terry, you've raised that really well, and it's obviously starting to flow through in our thinking in different ways. So I'm wondering, have you seen organisations that have done that well, that are really starting to think about it, how it's impacting workers, spectators, and making changes? Not just, I mean, I guess there's that higher level, like you talked about F1, and they're thinking, oh yes, we've got to think about our drivers and what's happening with them. But I guess more from that community sport or other kind of organisations. Have you seen any organisations that are starting to implement that kind of thinking?
Absolutely. I'll give you a couple of examples. Marrickville Golf Club, which is the one I mentioned at the start of the presentation. It's a small Sydney-based golf course. It runs along the Cooks River, and it's really starting to engage with its workers, and it's really starting to engage with council, because council owns the land. And what the course is doing, it understands that it needs to put its hand up and demonstrate what it's doing to protect people, ecosystems, and the community. And it's doing a great job. And some examples are the staff are trained and inducted in environment, health and safety. They are mapping all their sustainability features, and they include this wave rock, which is an amazing Indigenous structure that they enhance and protect. They're putting in community resting chairs under shaded trees. They're building walkways through right next to mangroves, and they protect the mangroves. They're putting in vegetated buffer zones and no spray zones near sensitive environmental receptors. And they're sharing that information with the community. Another example is Peninsula Kingswood Country Club. They improved the literacy of their staff, and within days, hundreds of members were hounding the staff, asking them, tell me more about what we're doing and how great this facility is, and what you're doing to protect us and this asset. And they were able to do that. And that's a real powerful message. If the workers and the people that are helping us in community sports maintain these facilities can hold the climate conversation and then take action, that's really powerful.
Absolutely, it is. Look, I am just conscious of the time. It is just after 12 o'clock, and so that's the hour, and I know some people have had to leave already. Can I get everybody to help me thank Terry for the fantastic presentation today? And again, if anybody has any questions that they think of later, please feel free to send me an email. I do just want to get in a couple of small plugs for some upcoming stuff for Sports Environment Alliance. So you would have received your notification about the AGM, which is coming up on the 14th of November. So please, we hope you can get along to that. We have another event you might be familiar with the BASIS webinars that we do in conjunction with BASIS in the UK. So we've got one coming up on Tuesday, the 5th of December. So put that in your diaries. That's going to be focusing on cricket and sustainability. So there'll be presenters from Lords and from the MCG here in Australia. And then stay tuned. We're pegging down the final elements of the summit for next year. And so we will be releasing the date and the information about that very shortly. So we hope to see you all at the summit for next year. But again, thank you all so much for coming. And thank you so much, Terry, again, for a really insightful presentation. We really appreciate it.
My
Thanks,
pleasure.
everybody.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Rebecca, for all your work.
Thanks, everyone.
Good to see
Bye.
everybody.
There we go.
There you go. That was great.
Yeah, really good.